Akmosha, Tutmosha, all these different Moseses. That is he based on any of these?
No, the book of Numbers is very interesting. It's about what is happening to the children of Israel as they've disobeyed God, and so they're going to be having to spend 40 years in the wilderness. As the children of Israel grumble, they don't like the food they're eating, or there's not enough water, and they grumble against Moses. And in one of these episodes, he punishes them by releasing these serpents, these deadly serpents. Anybody they bite dies. And so Moses prays for the people, and God says, okay, the way to do it is to make it this kind of talisman. You make this pole and put a bronze serpent on it. Anybody who looks at it won't be hurt by these snakes. That ends up being an important figure in the New Testament. The Gospel of John uses that to say that it's like Christ hanging on the cross. The Israelites are forced to build the city of Pi-Ramses, and this city was built in the middle of the 13th century. Pharaoh at the Exodus was Ramses II. One problem with that is that in the book of Exodus, he leads his army against the Israelites, and he and his entire army get wiped out. I mean, we have records of his rule after this event would have happened. But I remember when I was an evangelical Christian, we had heard all these rumors. Oh my God, they found chariots in the bottom of the Red Sea. Not true at all. Right.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with the great Dr. Bart Ehrman, who I love getting back on the channel to ask him some questions about the course that's coming up, which is about Moses, finding Moses, and what scholars know about the Exodus in the Jewish law. This is a question that a lot of people probably want to know. So links in the description for that. Check that out. I'm going to be there. And also, you'll be helping me out as well. If you want to help support this channel, you'll help me out by using my link. With that being said, my first question is, off the rip, what is your opinion on historical Moses? Is he based on any particular person? I hear people say Akmosha, Tutmosha, all these different Moseses. What's your opinion on? Is he based on any of these people, or no?
No. So he's not. One of the questions I'll be dealing with in the course, not the only question, but was there Moses at all, and what kind of evidence is there? But the interesting thing about is the one that you're mentioning is that the name Moses turns out not to be a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian name, and it does show up in the names of some pharaohs, for example, Tutmosis and things, and so that's an interesting phenomenon because. For all sorts of reasons. One being that if this was a story made up by Israelites, why didn't they give him a Hebrew name? And so where does the name come from? But there's nothing to suggest that he was based on any other historical figure that we know about.
Another thing that people like to ask about or talk about is the Hyksos. And when we look at the Hyksos explosion, it's way before the so-called Israelite Exodus. Do you think that this could be allegorizing this event, or do you think they're not related at all?
So the deal is that Egypt was a place that people immigrated to sometimes. Peoples did, not just like individuals, but there would be groups. And the Hyksos were a group of people that did come into Egypt and actually took over. I mean, the Hyksos actually ruled Egypt, and then ended up being driven out. And it kind of sounds like in the Old Testament, Joseph goes down and he becomes second hand to Pharaoh, and he's the ruler. And then later, generations later, his people are driven out. So it kind of sounds like that. And so I remember when I was in graduate school back in the late 80s, the Hyksos theory was a big deal. That it wasn't used in order to say what you're saying. What you're saying is maybe like they know about this Hyksos thing and they're like modeling it in their own stories. And that's an interesting possibility. What people were saying in my day, where they were saying, well, so it's completely plausible that this happened because we have evidence of it happening with the Hyksos, and maybe actually this story is part of the Hyksos invasion. As you pointed out, though, the dates don't work very well because the the when we date dating the Exodus is a little bit tricky, but most scholars today agree that it was sometime in the middle of the 13th century, the BCE. So 1250 or whatever, and so that would be long after the Hyksos were out of there.
Yeah, that's a good point. And another thing I want to ask you about is people like to talk about how if there really was this giant exodus of people going through the desert. I mean, if we go to the text, it talks about they had these tents set up and the Ark of the Covenant is in the middle. Don't you think there'd be some sort of something left behind? There'd be something to ask you this. Is there anything at all?
Well, no, there's no archaeological evidence, and that has led to some disputes, of course, among scholars. There are scholars, not just fundamentalists and evangelicals, but there are historical scholars who think that there is some historical basis for the Exodus, and they have to deal with the fact that there really is no archaeological evidence for it. And some of them say, well, look, we're talking about stuff that was going on like this is the 21st century AD CE, and that was the 13th century BC. So like, how much stuff you expect to find in the sand actually? But I remember when I was an evangelical Christian, we had heard all these rumors. Oh my God, they found chariots in the bottom of the Red Sea. Like, not true at all.
Right.
And the deal is, what your point is a really good one, because the book of Exodus itself and the book of Numbers indicate that the people who left, the Israelites who left Egypt, that there were 600,000 men of military age. So you're not talking about old men, you're not talking about children, you're not talking about women. 600,000. So you add all the others, what is that? 2.5, 3 million people? And one problem is, that's more than the population of Egypt would have been by a long shot. But apart from that, 3 million people, there's going to be some kinds of remains like pottery or weaponry or I mean there we have stuff from well before that for other civilization. There's nothing. And so that's that does cause problems for think that anything like what the Bible describes happened. It's a problem because you'd expect some remains.
Yeah, and one of the things that shook my faith from hearing about this was that how the text tells you that they're starving and thirsty, and they're like all about to die, and then all of a sudden they're ready to go to war and fight against whoever is the Midianites or whoever. Like who's building the armor, the weapons? Who's doing all this? Who's feeding the army? Like you got to think of the logistics of this. It doesn't even. It's impossible.
Yeah, how do you smelt the swords, for example? I mean, how do you do that? And I know, and but there are all sorts of weird things like that. I mean, like when Pharaoh starts chasing them, Pharaoh has a change of heart after they leave, and he decides to chase them, and he's chasing them, and the text says that he gathered together his 600 chariots, and the Israelites were afraid of this. 600 chariots. There are 3 million of these people. There's 600,000 warriors. That's 1,000 warriors for every chariot. Surely a chariot. It's not like a machine gun, where you can just mow them down. I mean, if you got 1,000 people to attack a chariot, that doesn't seem to be a very fearsome prospect to me.
That's a good point. And I know that in the Old Testament, it just mentions Pharaoh, but doesn't say which Pharaoh it is. Does anybody have an idea if this is based on Ramses or anything else?
Yeah. There are. This is one of those areas that it seems like there could be some historical something behind it. We're told that the Israelites are forced to build the city of Pi-Ramses, and this city was built in the middle of the 13th century. And so what it suggests is that the Pharaoh at the Exodus was Ramses II, and one problem with that is that in the book of Exodus, he leads his army against the Israelites, and he and his entire army get wiped out. But we know Ramses. I mean, we have records of his rule after this event would have happened, and so there's no. So that doesn't really work. You can actually see his mummy if you go to Egypt.
That's a good point. And I think that right there, what you just said, sort of defeats the Hyksos theory, because that's 200, 300 years after the Hyksos.
Yeah,
I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. No, that's it. If it's the mid 13th century, and if it's Ramses II, then yeah, the Hyksos thing doesn't work.
Right.
The Hyksos thing would work as kind of an analogous situation, and so you could. I think what people do is they imagine we have records. We actually have records unconnected with the Bible of Semitic groups going down into Egypt, and we have one letter, a letter that survives, that talks about a Semitic group escaping from Egypt. And so I think what people who think that there's some kind of historical root here, and I'm not uncomfortable with that. I think that it makes sense. There's something behind it, but that you're talking about like a small group of people who got out of there, and later as they started telling their stories, you know, it's like when you tell your story about this guy you just thrashed in a debate. Oh, I creamed him, man! Like he had nothing to say to me. You actually listen to the debate. Actually, he had a lot to say to you. So you start exaggerating things when you win, and then over centuries, right? It turns out there are 3 million of them, and so yeah.
Just like the New Testament, where you got Jesus. Well, when he died, all the graves opened up, and there's dead people walking around. It's like
Yeah,
even the gospel writers are like, nah, I don't think that happened. But
well, that's right. And there you're dealing with, a tradition maybe 50 years later. Imagine if that tradition showed up, 500 years later.
right.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this Moses raising up the serpent. It's from I'm sorry, is it from Leviticus, I think? And where I'm sorry, Numbers 21. I don't know why I have my notes all off. Numbers 21, he takes a bronze serpent in the wilderness, and he makes a fiery serpent, puts it on a standard, and says, if anyone is bitten, looks at it, he shall live. What does this even mean? Do you have any opinion on this?
Um, the book of Numbers is very interesting. It's about what is happening to the children of Israel as they've disobeyed God, and so they're going to be having to spend 40 years in the wilderness. God wants the generation that left Egypt not to get the promised land, so it has to be their children. So he has to wait 40 years. And so there's all sorts of events happening during these 40 years. And usually the way the events work is the children of Israel grumble. They don't like the food they're eating, or there's not enough water, and they grumble against Moses, and God punishes them. In one of these episodes, he punishes them by releasing these serpents, these deadly serpents. Anybody they bite dies. And so Moses prays for the people, and God says, okay, the way to do it is to make it this kind of talisman. You make this pole and put a bronze serpent on it. Anybody who looks at it then won't be hurt by these snakes. That ends up being an important figure in the New Testament. The Gospel of John uses that to say that it's like Christ hanging on the cross. It's
Right.
the one you look at for salvation.
Yeah, it's like, how dare you starve and thirst? Now I'm going to kill you.
And how 3 million people look on this serpent is a little bit hard to figure out. Wow,
But
good
that,
sight. Binoculars.
but I like where you're going with this, how they're borrowing this sort of theology in the New Testament. And there's another thing that I noticed in Leviticus where they have this sort of sin. It's Yom Kippur ritual where they
Yeah.
have one goat where they let that goat free. And that's Azazel, the scapegoat. And they have another goat that they slaughter in the temple, and he's the sin offering, I think with a bull as well. So I think there's 3 total animals. Do you think this is being allegorized in the New Testament where you have Jesus with with Barabbas, and they let Barabbas go, but then they kill Jesus and he's the sin offering? Do you think there's something going on there?
A lot of people have thought so, and it's a little bit tricky because in the Christian tradition, Jesus' death, Jesus takes sin upon himself and dies, and so he puts sin to death, and so he dies for your sins. The problem with the scapegoat thing, this is in Leviticus chapter 16, is that the goat that is slaughtered is not the goat that takes the sin upon itself. The scapegoat, they put their hand, so all the sins go onto the scapegoat, and it runs off into the wilderness, so it gets rid of the sins. The other goat is killed as the sacrifice. And so it's a little bit hard to work out the analogy with the New Testament accounts of Jesus' death, although there are a lot of people who think that there is something like that going on there.
Now I've thought about
Jesus' death, by the way, is called an atonement. And so
right.
Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement, and his death is called an atonement. But how you work out with the goats is a
Well,
problem.
I've actually thought about this.
Okay, good.
The Book of Hebrews talks about our Jesus was killed outside of the temple. And I wonder if they're polemicizing the whole temple thing and saying that you don't need the temple anymore. We're a universal. The world is the church now.
Yeah, I think he actually says outside the gate, outside the walls of Jerusalem, which is
Okay.
your point only kind of exaggerated a little bit because it
Yeah.
means it's not Jerusalem, the holy city where the temple is and the sacrifices are. The book of Hebrews makes a very big point that Jesus is superior to everything in the Jewish system, and so he's the perfect sacrifice. And so you don't need these other sacrifices anymore. And so it could be playing. It is certainly playing with the sacrificial image of the Old Testament in order to show that Jesus is the culmination. And so for the book of Hebrews, the way I usually try to explain it is that Hebrews imagines that the Old Testament is like an architectural design for a building. Like you have an architect designs what the building's going to look like, then he builds the building. When you got the building, you don't need the design anymore. And so Judaism is the design for what's going to be fulfilled with Jesus, so you can get rid of the other thing now.
Wow, that's a good point. I think I have 1 more minute left. I wanna ask you about when Moses meets with God. It's sort of do you think there's an actual God standing there, like an anthropomorphic figure, a person, or do you think he's just is this a vision? What do you think about this?
So there are several incidents where Moses has an encounter with God, and they're narrated in different ways. The most impressive one is in Exodus 20, right before he receives the Ten Commandments. And the way that one is portrayed is that God is not this anthropomorphic being. This is what they call a theophany, an appearance of God, where there's like thunder and lightning and clouds and dark, and like you're scared out of your wits. It's that kind of thing. And so it isn't like God showing up. It's not like the Garden of Eden, where God shows up to Adam and Eve walking through the garden. It's like he is like the transcendent Almighty in that account. Um, but it does say that Moses, I mean, it starts off actually in Exodus 3, where it looks like the Lord is in this burning bush, and so you get. So my point is, you get these different kinds of things, and part of it is because you get different sources of tradition behind these books, and so you have different images of who God is and what it's like to encounter Him.
Wow, that's interesting. Now the link is in the description. Finding Moses: What Scholars Know About the Exodus and the Jewish Law. And thank you for your time, Dr. Bart. And you have just attained true gnosis.